"Congratulations," Levvenia said. "Now you'll understand why I've been so tired." Isidora had expected tears. She had rehearsed for tears during the entire walk down the corridor, practicing the particular expression she would wear. Sympathetic, but triumphant. The kind of look that says, "I'm sorry for you," without actually meaning it. She had even rehearsed what she would say if Levvenia cried, "Oh, don't be upset, sister. Not everyone finds love at the same time." Instead, Levvenia simply looked at the sapphire ring on Isidora's finger, looked at it the way a physician examines a patient, carefully, without emotion, and said those words. The smile disappeared from Isidora's face before she remembered to put it back. "What does that mean?" Isidora asked. Levvenia had already turned back to the ledger open on her desk. "It means, I'm happy for you," she said. "Lord Tristram is a decent man. He greets the stable hands by name. That matters more than people realize." She dipped the pen and continued writing. "When did he propose?" "Yesterday evening." Isidora lifted her hand slightly to watch the morning light catch the stone. "In the rose garden? The eastern garden or the western one?" "What does it matter which garden? The eastern garden needs the climbing roses trimmed before autumn. If you had an evening in the western garden, the candles would have reflected better off the fountain." Levvenia turned a page without looking up. "I'll send someone to trim the eastern roses this week." Isidora stared at her sister's bent head, at the ink-stained fingers moving steadily across the account book, and felt something she couldn't quite name. Something between irritation and unease, like a door she had expected to swing open that had instead simply stood still. She had wanted to wound something. She wasn't certain she'd found it. "You're not even a little sad?" Isidora said. Levvenia finally looked up. Her face held no performance. "Why would I be sad?" "Because I'm getting married first. Because people will talk." Isidora set her chin. "Aunt Beatrice already said that gentlemen avoid you because you're too proud. Or perhaps they simply don't notice you." A long silence filled the room. Outside, a cart rolled across the cobblestones below the window. Somewhere in the upper corridor, a maid was carrying a bucket. The ordinary sounds of Ashcraftoft Manor continued without interruption. "People will always find something to discuss," Levvenia said at last. "Let them. You have more important things to plan." She closed the ledger and reached for a second one. "Sit down, Isidora. Tell me what kind of flowers you want at the altar." That was the moment the door opened, and Lady Drusilla Ashcraftoft entered the room without knocking, as she always did, as she had always done, because rooms in this house were not Levvenia's rooms. They were simply the rooms Levvenia happened to be working in. Drusilla carried a bundle of papers tied with blue ribbon. She did not look at her stepdaughter's face. She did not look at Isidora's ring. She crossed to Levvenia's desk and set the bundle down with the decisive weight of someone delivering a verdict. "The guest list," she said. 230 names. The seating will need to be arranged before invitations go out. Otherwise, the Marchioness of Elverton will seat herself beside Lord Hadley, and we'll have a dispute before the soup arrives. Those two haven't spoken civilly in 4 years. She placed another sheet on top. "Musicians. I've already spoken to 2 ensembles. Neither is satisfactory. Find a third option. The florist requires a deposit by Thursday. The chapel has a scheduling conflict in the second week of October, so the ceremony must be either before or after. The dress fittings begin next Monday. The seamstress requires 3 sessions minimum." Another paper. "Lord Tristram's family will need accommodation. His mother travels with a personal physician and 2 ladies' maids. His uncle refuses to share a floor with anyone bearing the Ashcraftoft name for reasons I refuse to spend energy understanding. Solve it. She stepped back and surveyed Levvenia, the way one surveys a completed task. I expect the first draft of the seating arrangements by Friday morning. Levvenia's hands had settled in her lap during this recitation. She looked at the pile. She looked at her stepmother. "Of course," she said. Drusilla's eyes moved briefly to Levvenia's face, searching, perhaps, for the expression she always looked for and could never quite accept when she found it. Not resentment, not rebellion. Only that quiet steadiness, which somehow felt like its own form of reproach. "Isadora," Drusilla said, turning away, "your fitting is at 10. Don't be late." And she walked out. The door settled back into its frame. Isadora looked at the pile of papers and then at her sister. Levvenia was already untying the ribbon. "You're not going to say anything?" Isadora asked. "I'll begin with the seating chart. The Marchioness of Elverton should be near the windows. She runs warm." Levvenia separated the papers into 3 stacks, with practiced hands. "Go to your fitting, Isadora, and congratulations. I mean that." Isadora left. The sound of her footsteps retreated down the corridor. The room became quiet again. Levvenia did not move for a long moment. She simply looked at the 3 stacks of paper in front of her and breathed. One slow, measured breath, like a person stepping to the edge of a very long road and accepting that there is no other road. She did not notice her father in the doorway. Lord Gideon Ashcraftoft had wheeled himself close enough to see through the gap, close enough to hear every word. His hands gripped the armrests of his wheelchair. The knuckles had gone white sometime during Drusilla's recitation, and had not loosened since. His mouth was slightly open, as though he had been about to speak, and then found that the breath required for speech had abandoned him entirely. He watched his daughter reach for her pen. He watched her open the first sheet and begin to write. He pulled his wheelchair backward into the corridor without making a sound. His eyes remained on her until the door blocked his view. Then he sat very still in the dim hallway, and the shame that lived in his chest, that old, permanent, undefeated shame, pressed down on him with a weight that had nothing to do with his useless legs. He had been sitting in this wheelchair for 12 years. He had watched from inside it for 12 years, and watching, he had told himself, was at least a kind of witness. That somehow bearing witness excused him from bearing anything else. He knew, sitting in the hallway with the sounds of his daughter's pen reaching him through the door, that this had never been true. 12 years ago, Ashcraftoft Manor had smelled of roses and fresh bread, and a kind of careless confidence. The fountains in the east garden ran without interruption. The stable hands moved with the easy rhythm of people who expected their wages to arrive on time. Laughter existed inside the walls of this house. Not performed laughter, not polite laughter, but the kind that bursts out at unexpected moments and leaves everyone blinking with pleasant surprise. Levvenia had been 17. She had her mother's eyes and her father's appetite for problems. She approached them the same way Gideon approached an interesting map, leaning forward, already thinking about solutions before she had finished understanding the question. She could calculate the yield of a field rotation and recite 3 stanzas of Latin verse and argue with twice her age without raising her voice. And Gideon loved her the way he loved the best things in his life, quietly, completely, without needing to say so very often because he assumed she knew. The accident happened on an ordinary road. Rain, frightened horses, one wheel striking stone, The carriage tilting, Levvenia falling toward the open door, Gideon moving without thought, without choice, throwing himself across the carriage the way fathers do, the way it happens before the mind catches up with the body. He wrapped both arms around her and forced her back inside. The carriage overturned. Wood shattered. Glass exploded. Darkness. He had saved her life. He had not walked since. In the weeks that followed, the physicians came and went, and the money went with them, quietly, and then quickly, and then urgently. Levvenia withdrew from her academy without telling him until the letter was already sent. She sat beside his bed and told him, and he had said no. No, she must return. And she had adjusted his blanket with steady hands and said, "My education can wait." Her voice had been perfectly calm. He understood now, 12 years later, sitting in the hallway outside the room where she was planning her sister's wedding, that it had not been calm because she was unafraid. It had been calm because she had already made her decision before she entered the room, and she did not want to spend what was left of her courage on tears. He had watched her burn the letter. He had seen her from the hallway, the paper curling into ash, her face lit orange and gold by the fire. He had not gone in. He had told himself he would speak to her in the morning, that there was time, that she would reconsider. He had been wrong about all of it. She was 29 years old now. Her hands were rougher than any noble woman's hands ought to be. The dresses in her wardrobe were the same ones she had worn at 21, mended so many times that she had become expert at hiding the repairs. She had not left Ashcraftoft Manor for any purpose that was her own in more years than either of them cared to count. And this morning he had sat in the doorway and watched his daughter receive a pile of impossible work and say, "Of course." Gideon wheeled himself back to his room. He sat beside the window for a long time, looking at the eastern garden where the climbing roses needed trimming, and where no one had proposed to Levvenia by firelight or by fountain or by any light at all, because no one had ever been given the chance. A single tear moved down his face. He did not wipe it away. He sat there in the hallway until the sound of her pen stopped, and the room went quiet, and he heard her stand and move toward the window. He did not go in then either. He turned his chair and wheeled himself back toward his own room, and the only sound in the corridor was the soft roll of the wheels on the old stone floor, steady and slow, like the movement of something that has been going in the wrong direction for a very long time and has only just now recognized the fact. The invitations went out on the 14th of August. By the 15th, 3 guests had written back with scheduling conflicts. 1 had written back with dietary requirements so specific they constituted a philosophical position, and the florist had increased his deposit demand by 30%, because, he explained in a letter that managed to be both apologetic and entirely unapologetic, the cost of white peonies had risen dramatically since the previous season. Levvenia handled all of it before breakfast. She sat at the long table in the library at 6 in the morning, surrounded by correspondence and candle stubs, writing replies in a hand so steady it gave no indication of how long she had been awake. The household had not yet begun to stir. The kitchen fires were just being lit. Outside the window, the first pale light was arriving over the eastern fields, and somewhere in the stable a horse shifted and stamped, and these were the sounds that Levvenia worked inside, these quiet, early-morning sounds which she had come to think of as her own, because no one else was awake to claim them. Isadora had opinions about the flowers. She communicated these opinions by appearing in the library at irregular intervals and announcing them. "I've decided I want gardenias instead of peonies." Gardenias in October are difficult. The florist will charge a premium. Then pay it. This is my wedding. I'll speak to the florist. Levvenia made a note without looking up. And the centerpieces should be taller. I've seen arrangements at the Westerfield Ball that were at least 3 feet high. 3-foot arrangements will block conversation across the table. Your guests will spend the dinner speaking only to the people immediately beside them. Isadora considered this. Fine, 2.5 feet. I'll tell him 2 feet. He'll deliver 2.5. Florists always do. Levvenia turned a page. Is Lord Tristram's uncle resolved? I've moved him to the east wing, away from the Ashcraftoft portraits in the main corridor. That should limit his grievances. He'll find something new to complain about. Probably. But it won't be my fault, which is the important thing. Isadora watched her sister's pen move. She had that expression again, the one that meant she was searching for something to find fault with, and finding it difficult. You know, she said, most women in your position would be bitter. Levvenia looked up. My position. Unmarried, at 29, planning someone else's wedding. Isadora's voice was pleasant and exact, the way a blade can be pleasant and exact. Most women would be miserable. I expect they would, Levvenia agreed. She returned to her work. I'll have the updated seating chart on your mother's desk by Thursday. Isadora left. The door closed. Levvenia's pen stopped moving. She sat very still for a moment, looking at the page without reading it. Then she turned to a fresh sheet and began writing again. It was during the 3rd week of wedding preparations that Edward Beaumont's carriage appeared at the Ashcraftoft gates. Levvenia was in the kitchen garden when she heard the wheels on the gravel. She was checking the herb beds. Someone needed to, and the undergardener had been too occupied with the flower orders to notice that the thyme had grown completely into the sage. And she straightened up and looked toward the front of the house without thinking. She saw the carriage. She saw the Beaumont crest on the door. She went very still. She had not allowed herself to think about Edward Beaumont in years. She had been deliberate about this. She had folded the thought of him away the same way she had folded the Academy letter before dropping it into the fire. Precisely. And with the understanding that unfolding it would cost more than she could afford. She knew, in the way that you know certain things without examining them, that he had never remarried. She knew this, the way you know about weather in a country you have never visited, through the reports of people who have been there. She had never asked. She had simply known. He was 41 now. He would be thinner, probably. Men like Edward grew thinner as they aged, as though the years burned through something in them. She pressed her hands flat against the front of her apron and looked at the carriage. And then she looked away. And then she went back to the thyme, because the thyme needed attention. And Edward Beaumont had come to a house with 200 guests to organize, and she could not afford to be standing in the kitchen garden feeling things. She did not know that Drusilla had seen the carriage first. She did not know that Drusilla had met Edward at the door, had received him in the small sitting room, had offered him tea in the good cups, had sat across from him with the composed expression of a woman who has rehearsed a conversation for several years and is confident in her material. She did not know what was said between them. She would not know for another 3 hours, when Mrs. Halloway, the elderly cook who had worked at Ashcraftoft Manor for 23 years and had constituted herself the household's informal conscience for at least 15 of them, found Levvenia in the corridor outside the linen room and pressed a folded note into her hand. I heard it, Mrs. Halloway said, which was her version of an apology. I wasn't listening. I was in the passage near the sitting room, and my hearing is better than it has any business being at my age. I'm sorry, my lady. I thought you should know." Levvenia stood with the folded note in her hand. She looked at the cook's broad, worried face. "What did you hear?" Mrs. Halloway's jaw tightened. She said it plainly, which was the kindest way she knew to say unkind things. "My Lady Drusilla told him you had moved past it, that you'd had several years to reflect, and you were at peace with your decision. That you'd told her yourself you were not suited for marriage, and were content in your present situation." A pause. "And that you'd asked not to be disturbed with correspondence from the past." Levvenia did not speak. "He asked to see you himself," Mrs. Halloway said. "She told him it would cause you distress, that you were fragile about it." The cook's voice went flat with the effort of neutrality. He left without arguing. "I think he believed her, my lady. He looked like a man who has been told a kindness that costs him everything." The linen room door was slightly open. Through the gap, folded sheets were visible in precise white stacks. The smell of lavender came from inside. Everything was orderly and clean, and exactly as Levvenia had arranged it. She opened the folded note. Mrs. Halloway had written only the date of his departure and the direction of his carriage. The Beaumont estate was 40 miles northeast. The road through the valley was faster, but rougher. He would have taken the longer road. She folded the note again. She placed it in her pocket. "Thank you, Mrs. Halloway," she said. Her voice was her own. She had never been able to decide whether this was a strength or simply a habit. "My lady." Mrs. Halloway squeezed her hand once, briefly, and walked away. Levvenia stood in the corridor for a long moment. She could hear, from 3 rooms away, Isidora laughing at something. That bright, easy laugh that meant nothing had gone wrong in Isidora's immediate vicinity, and she was enjoying the confirmation. She could hear, from above, the sound of a trunk being dragged across floorboards as someone prepared another guest room. She had been robbed. Not of Edward, exactly. She had already surrendered that possibility herself, 7 years ago, under the oak tree in the western field while his carriage pulled away. She had surrendered it then, and it had cost her something she couldn't name, and she had continued because continuing was what you did. But she had surrendered it herself. She had made that choice herself, even if the choice had been made under duress. Even if she had been standing in a room where the air had been systematically removed until saying yes was the only way to breathe. What Drusilla had done was different. Drusilla had not taken a choice from her. Drusilla had reached into the past and erased the only story that had ever been Levvenia's alone, and replaced it with a version in which Levvenia had chosen all of this, had wanted all of this, was at peace with all of this. And Edward had believed it. Because why wouldn't he? Why would any reasonable person suspect that a mother would lie to prevent her stepdaughter from being happy? That evening, Levvenia sat in the library after everyone else had gone to bed. The candle on the desk burned low. She did not write. She simply sat and looked at the flame, and thought about the 12 years she had spent in this house, and the one story that had almost belonged to her, and the careful, deliberate hands that had taken it. She did not cry. She had spent too many years past that kind of crying. Instead, something settled in her chest, clear and cold and final, like the moment before a very long winter arrives, and you understand that the warmth is genuinely gone. She reached for her pen. She opened her private notebook, the one she kept separate from the estate ledgers, the one with her own handwriting that no one else had ever asked about because no one had ever thought to ask. She turned to a fresh page. She wrote one sentence, slowly and carefully, and then she closed the book. Later, she would not be able to remember exactly what she had written, but she remembered the feeling, like signing your own name in a language you have just finished learning how to speak. She sat for another hour after that. The household sounds eventually ceased. The last footsteps in the corridor, the last lamp extinguished in the upper hall. Ashcraftoft Manor settled into its nighttime quiet, which was a particular kind of quiet. The quiet of a very large house that has been held together through effort rather than ease. Levvenia knew every sound inside this quiet. She had spent 12 years learning them. The particular creak of the third stair from the landing, the draft that moved through the library from the east if the upper window was left unlatched, the way the grandfather clock in the entrance hall chimed slightly late, by 4 seconds, because the mechanism had needed adjustment for 6 years, and she had simply corrected for it in her mind, rather than spend the money on a clockmaker. She knew this house. She knew it the way you know something you have made your whole life into. Completely. And at a cost you didn't fully understand, until you looked up one evening and realized there was nothing left of you outside of it. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a long time. When she did, she dreamed of a road through green hills and a university library with books collected from across Europe. And somewhere in the dream, it was not too late to go. The night before the wedding, Levvenia did not sleep. This was not unusual. She had not slept well since she was 17 years old, since the night she had knelt beside her father's bed, with her hand wrapped around his unconscious one, and made a promise that sounded, even then, like something she could not entirely keep. She had become accustomed to the small hours, the way the house changed after midnight, growing quieter and somehow larger, the way the shadows in the library moved with the draft from the corridor, the way the candles burned differently when there was no one left to perform for. At 11:30, she completed the final venue confirmation for the chapel flowers. At midnight, she wrote out the morning schedule for the kitchen staff, timed to the quarter hour, and placed it in an envelope to be delivered before dawn. At 12:30, she organized the seating cards for the reception tables, 147 of them, each written in her best hand, each placed in its precise alphabetical stack. She finished at 1:10 past. The library was very still. Outside, the October wind moved through the grounds of Ashcraftoft Manor with a sound like turning pages. The candle had burned to half its original height. Levvenia sat with her hands flat on the table and looked at the stacks of seating cards and the organized correspondence and the completed schedule. And she understood, with the particular clarity that comes only at 1 in the morning, that tomorrow would be perfect. She had made it perfect. She had made it perfect the way she made everything perfect. Alone, without assistance, without anyone asking whether she needed help, because no one had ever thought to ask. The flowers would be exactly where she had placed them. The musicians would arrive at the time she had confirmed. The carriages would run on the schedule she had constructed. The guests would find their seats without confusion, because she had anticipated every possible confusion and eliminated it in advance. Lord Tristram would marry Isidora in a ceremony that would be described, for years afterward, as flawlessly organized. No one would say her name. This was not a new thought. It had lived with her for a long time, alongside the thought about Edward, and the thought about the academy, and the thought about the letter she had burned when she was 18, and she had learned to carry it the way you carry stones in your pockets. You forget they are there until you sit down, and then you remember all at once. She reached under the desk and withdrew the notebook. It was a plain thing. Brown cover, no decoration, the kind of book a steward might carry for ordinary notes. But inside it was 12 years of work. Every tenant agreement, every supplier contract, every medicine schedule for her father's specific requirements, every note about which servants responded to direct instruction and which needed to be approached differently, every detail about the seasonal rhythms of the estate, when to plant, when to harvest, when to negotiate with the grain merchants before they realized the leverage was theirs. Every debt Amos had created, listed in order, with the date it had been resolved and the method used. Every birthday, every anniversary, every recurring appointment that kept the household functioning without anyone ever noticing that it needed to be kept. She had never shown this notebook to anyone. No one had ever asked what was inside it. It sat on the shelf beside the estate ledgers and the household accounts, and because it looked like all the other notebooks, it was invisible. And because it was invisible, she was invisible. And because she was invisible, this notebook was the only complete record of what she had done with 12 years of her life. She opened it to the last written page, read it through, then turned to a blank page at the back. And for the first time since she was 17 years old, she wrote something that was not for the estate, and not for her father, and not for Amos, and not for Isadora, and not for anyone else inside this house. She wrote for herself, slowly because it had been so long that she wasn't certain of the grammar of this particular exercise. It came back the way things come back when they have only been set down, not discarded, with effort and then with ease, and then with something that was almost painful in its familiarity. She wrote about the university library she had never visited. She wrote about the books she had borrowed from the village lending library and read in stolen hours, and the particular pleasure of a novel that has no practical use. She wrote about the way soil smells in early spring and how she knew this only from estate work, from checking drainage in the lower fields, and how she had noticed it anyway. She wrote about Edward, briefly, honestly, in the past tense. She wrote about the feeling of watching Isadora grow from a small girl who climbed into her bed during thunderstorms to a woman who could look directly at her and say, "Most women in your position would be bitter," and the distance between those two versions of the same person, and the fact that she had loved them both. She wrote about the wedding tomorrow. She wrote about walking into the church and seeing everything exactly as she had planned it. Every flower in its place, every chair aligned, every candle lit at the correct interval. She wrote about the feeling of watching Isadora walk down that aisle in the gown with the pearl buttons Levvenia had fastened herself this morning during the last fitting, and how she would stand near the back and watch 147 guests enjoy the day she had built, and none of them would know. She sat back. She looked at the ceiling. The plaster had been repaired 3 years ago. She had arranged for the craftsman, had supervised the work on 3 separate days, had approved the final result. The ceiling looked exactly as it had before the crack appeared. No one knew there had ever been a crack. She looked at the notebook in her hands. She looked at 12 years of invisible work, neatly organized and comprehensively documented. She turned to the very front page. In the top right corner, in her own handwriting, she had written the date she had begun the book. 18 years old. October. The same month as Isadora's wedding. She had begun this book the week she accepted the estate ledger from the old steward, and understood that the estate was hers now. Not because anyone had given it to her, but because there was no one else. She closed the book. She set it on the table beside the seating cards. She looked at it sitting there, and she understood something she should perhaps have understood a long time ago. This notebook would still be here tomorrow, and the day after, and every day after that. Its pages would still be full of her work. But if she walked out the front gates of Ashcraftoft Manor with it under her arm, no one in this house would be able to replace a single thing written inside it. Not Drusilla, who had never learned how the estate actually ran, because Levvenia had always run it before Drusilla needed to know. Not Amos, who had borrowed his way through adulthood, while Levvenia quietly settled each bill before their father discovered it. Not Isidora, who had moved from her comfortable girlhood to her comfortable marriage, without ever needing to understand what comfort cost. A candle guttered. Another burned steadily. She sat in the library of Ashcraftoft Manor at 2 in the morning, and she felt, for the first time in 12 years, the shape of a decision forming that was entirely her own. She did not make it yet. Not tonight. Tonight, she was still the woman who had planned every minute of tomorrow, and would carry it through flawlessly, because that was what she did, and who she was, and had been for so long, that she was no longer certain there was a difference. Before she could sit longer with that thought, the library door opened. She did not have time to close the notebook. She simply pressed her hand flat over the open page. It was not Drusilla. It was Mrs. Halloway, the cook, carrying a lamp with both hands and wearing the expression of a woman who has resolved to do a difficult thing and will not be deterred from it. "My lady." The cook set the lamp on the corner of the table and did not look at the notebook or the sealed envelopes or the 147 seating cards. She looked at Levvenia's face. "There's something I should have told you sooner. Tonight, I decided I couldn't let it wait." Levvenia watched her. "Mrs. Whitmore," the cook said, "the widow from Barrowfield. She came to the manor 6 weeks ago. I mentioned it to you." "I remember." "What I didn't mention," Mrs. Halloway folded her hands together, the way she did when she was measuring words carefully, "is that she came specifically to speak to you, not to my lady Drusilla. She brought a letter, a personal letter, from a solicitor in Norwich." A pause. "She said it concerned an annuity left by the Bower family, a cousin of the late Lady Ashcraftoft, your mother. She said the letter was addressed to you." Levvenia went still. "My lady Drusilla received her," Mrs. Halloway continued. "I wasn't in the room, but afterward Mrs. Whitmore passed me in the corridor on her way out, and she looked like a person who had been told a kindness that also closed a door." The cook met Levvenia's eyes. "I asked her was everything resolved, and she said very quietly that Lady Levvenia was comfortable in her circumstances and had no need of outside assistance at this time." The library was absolutely quiet. "My lady Drusilla said those words to Mrs. Whitmore," Mrs. Halloway said, "on your behalf, without asking you." Levvenia looked down at the notebook under her hand. She looked at the candle flame. She looked at the 147 seating cards, each one written in her own handwriting, each one exactly correct. She did not know how much the annuity was. She did not know whether it would have been enough to change anything. What she knew, sitting in the library at 2 in the morning, the night before the wedding she had built, was that the choice had been made for her, again, by someone who had a vested interest in the outcome, again, and that she had not been asked again, and that this was not the first time, and it was not the worst thing that had been done to her in this house, but it was one thing too many. "Thank you," she said to the cook. Her voice was its own, level and clear. Mrs. Halloway nodded. She picked up her lamp. At the door, she paused. my lady. Whatever you decide tomorrow, after the wedding, I want you to know that I think you're owed a great deal more than this house has ever paid you." She said it plainly, without sentimentality. Then she left. The door settled back into its frame. Levvenia sat alone in the library with the candle and the seating cards and the notebook and the news that had just arrived 12 years too late. She sat with all of it, in the specific silence of a person who has just understood the full shape of something they had only partly seen before. The candle burned. She did not move to replace it when it finally guttered and went out. She simply sat in the dark for a while. She had almost forgotten what it felt like to let something run out without rushing to replace it. It felt, she realized, like beginning. Dawn came to Ashcraftoft Manor, and Levvenia was already in the kitchen. By 6, the breakfast arrangements for 200 guests had been confirmed. By 7, the chapel had received its final floral delivery, and a servant had been dispatched to verify the arrangement against the schematic Levvenia had drawn 3 weeks prior. By 7:30, the seamstress had arrived in tears. The wedding veil had torn during transport, and Levvenia had sat at the small table near the linen room with a needle and the finest thread in the house and repaired the damage so precisely that no one would ever find the seam. She worked through the morning without stopping. When the kitchen burned the breakfast rolls for the first sitting, she reorganized the menu without raising her voice. When heavy clouds arrived at mid-morning and threatened the outdoor portion of the reception, she directed 4 servants to prepare the ballroom as an alternative before anyone else had registered that the sky was changing. When 2 carriages arrived in the wrong order and blocked the gate, she spoke briefly to the coachman, and the problem dissolved. No one thanked her. They simply found that the problems were gone. She dressed for the wedding in 10 minutes. The gown was the faded blue one, mended and mended again until the mending was structural rather than cosmetic. She had spent the last of her personal allowance 3 months ago on a replacement ribbon for the collar. In the mirror, she looked like a woman who has dressed for function, not occasion. She looked at her reflection for approximately 4 seconds. Then she went to help her father with his ceremonial jacket, which his trembling hands could no longer manage alone. The ceremony was flawless. Sunlight arrived through the stained glass windows exactly on schedule, falling in colored pools across the stone floor of the chapel. The musicians began the processional at the correct moment. The flowers were exactly as ordered. Lord Tristram stood at the altar with an expression of quiet, genuine happiness, which Levvenia had always considered the most reliable indicator of a man's character. When Isidora entered the chapel in the ivory gown with the repaired veil and the pearl buttons, she was beautiful in the uncomplicated way of someone who has always been well cared for and accepted this as the natural order of things. The congregation watched. No one wondered who had made the flowers possible. No one asked who had arranged the musicians or coordinated the carriages or repaired the veil in the linen room before 7 in the morning. They simply experienced a beautiful ceremony and assumed that beautiful ceremonies arrive of their own accord. Levvenia stood near the back and watched her sister get married. She examined this honestly, standing in the chapel with the colored light across her hands. She felt something that was not quite grief, and not quite relief, and not quite loneliness, but contained elements of all 3. She felt the 12 years most clearly here, in this church, surrounded by evidence of her own work. She felt them the way you feel a scar in cold weather. Not as pain exactly, but as a reminder that something had happened that could not be made to unhappen. She did not cry. She clapped when the minister declared them married. She smiled at the guests who turned around to see who was near the back. She accepted, without correcting it, the polite assumption of several elderly noblewomen who concluded she was household staff. "It will be brought immediately," she said, when a woman asked for more tea. And she brought it. The reception stretched into the afternoon, and then into the evening. Levvenia kept moving. A child fell ill in the eastern drawing room and needed someone to sit with her until a physician arrived. A guest required different accommodation because the room she'd been assigned faced west, and she could not sleep facing west, for reasons that were not explained. The kitchen needed approval for an additional dessert course because the chef had, apparently, experienced an unexpected inspiration during the soup service. She solved all of it. It was late in the evening when Amos climbed onto the small platform near the fireplace. He was significantly drunk. He had been significantly drunk since approximately 3 in the afternoon, which Levvenia knew because she had tracked the bottle count as part of her general monitoring of the event, and she had been hoping he would simply become unconscious before he became public. She had been wrong about this. He raised his glass with the unsteady grandeur of a man who believes he is making a speech and will regret it in the morning. "My elder sister," he announced, in the carrying voice of someone who has surrendered all internal volume regulation, "deserves recognition tonight." The room quieted with the polite attention of people who have consumed enough wine to be interested in whatever happens next. "She has reached 29 years of age," Amos continued, "without locating a husband." He paused for comedic effect. "Some speculate that she frightened them all away with the account books. Others suggest she simply prefers organizing other people's weddings to having one of her own." Laughter moved through the ballroom. Levvenia lowered her eyes to the glass in her hand. She heard the laughter the way you hear sounds in a dream, clearly, but at a remove, as though they were happening slightly to one side of the world she was standing in. Lord Tristram looked uncomfortable. Gideon, near the window in his wheelchair, closed his eyes. Then Isadora rose. She rose with the graceful deliberateness of someone who has been waiting for her moment, and when the room went quiet, she lifted her crystal glass and turned toward her sister with an expression that was entirely convincing if you were not paying close attention. "I must also thank Levvenia," she said. Her voice was warm and clear. "Every family needs someone willing to sacrifice everything." She smiled as the guests nodded approvingly. "Levvenia has always given up her own happiness for ours. She is, and has always been, exactly what this family needed." Applause. Genuine and enthusiastic applause, from guests who heard these words as affection and gratitude, and a lovely tribute from a new bride to her elder sister on her wedding day. Levvenia heard them correctly. She heard, "You are useful. You have always been useful. We are glad you were available to be used." She stood inside that applause and felt the last of something give way, not loudly, not with any particular drama, but with the definitive quiet of a thing that has been bearing weight for 12 years, finally putting it down. She thought about Mrs. Halloway in the corridor 3 weeks ago. She thought about the letter from the solicitor in Norwich that had reached Drusilla's hands and never reached hers. She thought about Edward on the road, believing a lie because it had been delivered with the authority of someone who had no reason to lie. She thought about the academy letter, curling in the fireplace, and her father watching from the hallway, and 12 years of seating cards written in her own hand, and the notebook, and the candle that had burned down to nothing. She thought, "I have been very patient." She set her glass on a nearby tray. She walked to the center of the room. She did not plan it. Planning was what she had spent 12 years doing, and she was, tonight, finished with planning. "I would like to say something," she said. The room quieted. People turned. Some of them were smiling, expecting a gracious return of the toast. Drusilla, near the center of the room, went very still. Levvenia looked at her stepmother. She did not look away. 12 years ago," she said, "I made a promise beside my father's bed. I said I would not let this family fall apart." Her voice was level. It required no volume to carry. The room was listening. "I kept that promise. I kept every promise I made to this family." She turned her head slightly, taking in the room, the guests, the flowers, the musicians who had played without interruption, the tables set to the precise specifications she had designed. This wedding was planned, organized, and executed by me. Every invitation was written by my hand. Every arrangement was confirmed by me. The veil on my sister's dress was repaired by me at 7 this morning. The ballroom was prepared for rain by me before any of you noticed the clouds. Silence, complete silence. "I did this gladly," she said. "I would do it again for my sister, because I love her, and because I know she does not understand, has never been asked to understand, what any of it costs." She paused. "But I want to be clear about something. My stepmother will tell you I chose this life, that I am at peace with it, that I declined to marry because I preferred responsibility." She looked directly at Drusilla. "She said this to a man who came here 6 weeks ago to ask whether he had misunderstood something. She said it to spare herself the inconvenience of managing this estate without me." Drusilla's face had gone the color of old paper. "I am not at peace with it," Levvenia said. "I am exhausted by it. I have been exhausted by it for years. And tonight, while all of you applaud my willingness to sacrifice, I am going to do something I have not done in 12 years. She looked at the room one final time. She looked at her father, whose face had gone very still, whose eyes were bright with something that was not quite grief and not quite relief, the same thing she had felt in the chapel. She looked at Isidora, whose expression had moved through surprise and discomfort, and was arriving somewhere more complicated. "I am going to leave," Levvenia said simply, "and I am not coming back to solve the next problem." She walked toward the door. No one moved to stop her. Amos made a sound, and then thought better of it. Drusilla's mouth opened. "After everything Drusilla began. "After everything I have done," Levvenia said, without turning around, "it is finally time I did something for myself." She walked out of the ballroom. Her footsteps crossed the entrance hall. The front door of Ashcraftoft Manor opened and then closed. Behind her, the ballroom was completely silent. Then, from somewhere inside the silence, Gideon's voice, quiet, final, like a man putting down something he has carried for too long. "Good," he said. "Good girl." The following morning, Drusilla found the notebook on the library table. She opened it. She read the first 3 pages. She sat down heavily in the chair Levvenia had occupied for 12 years. She kept reading. By the time she reached the section on supplier negotiations, her hands had begun to tremble. By the time she reached the section on Amos's debts, itemized, dated, each one quietly resolved before Lord Gideon had a chance to discover it, she had stopped reading and was simply sitting with the open book in her lap and the full weight of what she had required of one person pressing down on her from 12 years of evidence. She closed the notebook. She sat with it against her chest, the way Lord Gideon had sat with a different notebook in a different room, Outside, the morning birds were singing. The kitchen fires were unlit because no one had delivered the instructions. The household schedule had not appeared on the headmaid's desk. The suppliers who arrived at 9 found no one who knew which deliveries to accept. The stable boy did not know which horses to prepare. The servants gathered in the corridors and asked each other the question that would define the coming weeks. Where is Lady Levvenia? The cottage was very small. It had 2 rooms and a fireplace and a garden that had been mostly left to do as it liked for several seasons, which meant it was overgrown in a way that looked, depending on your disposition, either neglected or romantically wild. The widow who owned it was 81 years old and had spent a long life learning to tell the difference between people who needed peace and people who needed rescuing, and she had concluded, within 20 minutes of meeting Lady Levvenia Ashcraftoft, that this was a woman who needed peace and had never been given access to any. She rented the cottage for a modest sum and asked no questions. She delivered soup once a week and left it on the doorstep without knocking. For the first 4 days, Levvenia did not know what to do with herself. She woke before dawn out of habit, sat up in the narrow bed with her heart already organizing the morning's work, medicine schedule, kitchen instructions, the supplier arriving at 9, Amos's debt letter requiring a response, and then remembered there was nothing. She lay back down. She stared at the ceiling of the small room, which had a water stain in the shape of a country she didn't recognize, and she listened to the silence, which was absolute and therefore terrifying. On the second morning, she walked to the village. On the third, she borrowed 2 books from the lending library and read for 6 hours without stopping. And when she laughed at a scene in the second novel, the sound startled her so thoroughly that she dropped the book. She picked it up. She kept reading. She did not apologize to anyone for the laugh, because there was no one to apologize to. On the morning of the 5th day, there was a knock at the cottage door. The widow appeared in the inner doorway with a puzzled expression. "My lady, there is a gentleman outside. He says his name is Duke Cyril Ravenshaw." Levvenia stood in the garden with her hands still carrying soil from the patch near the eastern wall that she had decided, without quite deciding it, to clear and replant. She had been out there since 7. The morning light was on the hills. The air was cold enough to be clarifying, warm enough to work in. She went to the door. Duke Cyril Ravenshaw stood a careful distance back from the entrance, his hat held in both hands, wearing a dark riding coat rather than anything ceremonial or impressive. He was perhaps 50, with the contained quality of someone who has survived grief and arrived on the other side of it, changed, but not diminished. He inclined his head when she appeared. "I hope you'll forgive this unexpected visit," he said. She returned the gesture. "Your Grace, I wasn't expecting anyone." "I know," a faint smile. "That is why I nearly turned back twice." He held her gaze, steady and without performance. "I've not come to disturb your peace. I simply wanted to thank you." She looked at him carefully. "Thank me for what?" "For reminding me that dignity still exists." He paused. "I witnessed something at the wedding that I have not been able to stop thinking about. A woman answered 12 years of injustice without becoming unjust herself. She was humiliated in front of 100 guests, and she did not use humiliation in return. She walked out, which is exactly what she should have done, but she walked out cleanly." He looked at her directly. "I find that remarkable. I came to say so." Levvenia felt heat rise to her face. She had spent enough years managing other people's emotions to recognize, with some embarrassment, when her own had been caught off guard. "There is no need to feel sorry for me, Your Grace. I assure you I do not." His voice was level and quiet. The kind of quiet that belongs to people who mean what they say, because they have stopped saying things they don't mean. I admire you. Those are different things. He placed a small parcel on the doorstep. Tea, he said, from his estate, nothing more, no expectation attached. He bowed. He left. Levvenia stood in the doorway and watched him walk down the village road until the road curved and he disappeared, and she remained standing there for a while after, because she was trying to determine whether what she had just experienced was pity dressed as something else, or whether it was simply what it appeared to be, which was a person seeing her clearly. She was not accustomed to this. It required a period of adjustment. They met again at the village school 3 weeks later. He visited to deliver books. His late wife had funded the school's lending library, and he continued the donations out of something that was not quite grief and not quite habit, but somewhere between them. Levvenia had been helping the elderly schoolteacher organize correspondence. They sat at opposite ends of the same long table and sorted books in companionable silence for 40 minutes before either of them said anything that wasn't about the books. He asked her, eventually, about the university library she had mentioned. She had said something, the first morning at the cottage, about books rescuing him many times, and she had said something about once believing she would spend her life surrounded by them. "What changed?" he asked. She considered the honest answer, which was complicated, and the simple answer, which was true. "Life," she said. He nodded. He understood without asking for more. She noted this. The ability to receive an incomplete answer without requiring it to be completed was, she had learned, rarer than it seemed. They walked through the public gardens one afternoon without planning to meet. They sat in his library at Ravensshire Estate one rainy Tuesday, when the walk became impossible, and she moved slowly along the shelves with her hands not quite touching the spines, and he watched her with an expression that she did not examine too closely. He told her about his late wife. He told her about the infant son who had lived only 4 days, and how grief for a very small person can be as complete and consuming as grief for any other, and how he had not told many people this, because most people responded in ways that tried to diminish the loss by contextualizing it. She listened without trying to diminish it. When she spoke about her own losses, she did not describe herself as a victim. She said, "I made choices that I believed were right at the time, and some of them weren't mine to make, and the difference between those two categories took me longer to see than it should have." He looked at her for a moment. "Who has ever done what was necessary for you?" She had no answer. They sat with this in silence, which was not uncomfortable. Meanwhile, 50 miles away, Ashcraftoft Manor was coming apart. The process was not dramatic. It was exactly as ordinary as Levvenia had always understood it would be. Slow, incremental, the kind of collapse that happens in the space between decisions rather than in any single moment. The household accounts fell behind because Drusilla could not read the system Levvenia had built without weeks of instruction she had never thought to request. Suppliers who had extended credit on the basis of Levvenia's reliable communication withdrew it when the communication stopped. 2 experienced servants resigned. The kitchen produced meals of uncertain quality because the weekly menu system had dissolved without the person who maintained it. Amos's forgeries came to light on a Tuesday. He had signed Lord Gideon's name to financial documents, 4 of them over 3 months, each one slightly larger than the last, each one intended to cover the previous loss. The officers who arrived at Ashcraftoft Manor were correct and efficient. They waited in the entrance hall with the patient quality of people who encounter this specific situation with some regularity. Amos descended the staircase with the irritated expression of a man who has not yet understood what kind of morning this is. He understood within 4 minutes. Gideon sat in the entrance hall and looked at the forged signatures and looked at his son and said quietly, "You forged my name." It was not a question. Amos's answer, "I only intended to borrow the money until I won it back," contained in 9 words everything that had been wrong with Amos for 20 years, and Gideon heard all of it. The carriage took Amos away through the front gates. Drusilla sat in the hall chair with her face in her hands. No one looked toward the corridor expecting Levvenia to appear and solve the crisis. She was gone. Isidora's marriage, which had begun with every material advantage, had not improved with acquaintance. Tristram was a good man, patient, observant, inclined toward fairness. And he had married a woman who had never needed to practice patience or develop observation or concern herself with fairness, because all of those things had been managed by someone else. He watched, over the weeks of their early marriage, as she blamed servants for problems they had not created, suspected him of attentions he had not given, and approached every difficulty as a personal affront rather than a problem to be solved. He thought about Levvenia often. He thought about her without romanticism, the way you think about evidence, as something that clarifies your understanding of a question you hadn't known you were asking. One November evening, he sat with Gideon in the library at Ashcraftoft Manor and listened to the old man speak. Gideon spoke for a long time, about the accident and the promise and the 12 years and the ledgers and the burned letter and every debt Amos had ever created that Levvenia had quietly made to disappear. He spoke with the cadence of a man performing a long-overdue confession, each sentence a small release of something he had been holding incorrectly. Tristram sat with Isidora later that evening and told her what he had learned. She folded her arms. "No one forced her," she said. "She chose that life." He looked at his wife for a long moment. He looked at the embroidery she had abandoned after 6 stitches. He looked at the cold tea no one had thought to replace. He did not say what he was thinking. He put it away instead, carefully, and began to consider what kind of future was available to a man who had married a woman who would say that about her sister. The poison, when it came to light, was the end of everything. The bottle had been discovered inside Isidora's dressing table during a household search that Tristram had ordered after finding a letter that did not mean what Isidora claimed it meant. The physician confirmed what was in it. The footman confirmed what he had seen. Isidora, when confronted, was silent for 4 seconds, and then began to cry in a way that was entirely sincere and entirely beside the point. The officers came, as they had come to Ashcraftoft Manor for Amos. Levvenia received the news in a letter delivered by the elderly widow, who held it out with the hesitation of someone who is not certain the medicine they are delivering will help. She read every word in silence. When she finished, she folded the letter and set it on the table and sat very still. Tears came without announcement. Not because of the justice of it, not because Isidora had been caught or punished or brought low. She cried because of a small girl with her arms around Levvenia's waist, calling her second mama. She cried because that girl still existed somewhere inside the woman who had stood in the ballroom and received applause for Levvenia's suffering, and the distance between those 2 versions of the same person was a grief with no appropriate shape. She covered her face. What happened to us? She thought. There was no answer, because the question was not really a question. The question was an acknowledgement that time moves in one direction, and some distances are not crossable. That evening, Cyril found her sitting in the village garden under the old beech tree. He did not ask what was wrong. He sat beside her on the bench, close but not intruding, and waited. The wind moved through the branches above them. A lamp was being lit in the house across the road. After a long time, Levvenia said, "I thought leaving would make it stop hurting." "It doesn't stop," he said. "It changes. That's the best I can offer." She looked at her hands. "I still love them. Even now." "I know." He said it simply, as a fact, as something that required no explanation and no apology. The people who hurt us most are often the ones we love most. That's not weakness. That's just how love works when it isn't handled carefully. She was quiet for a moment. "There's something I've wanted to say," he said, "for several weeks now." He turned toward her. He did not reach for her hand, or change his posture, or do anything that might constitute pressure. He simply looked at her with the open, certain expression of someone who has thought about this carefully and decided to be honest. "You spent 12 years building everyone else's happiness," he said. "I would like to spend the rest of my life building yours, if you'll allow it." She searched his face. She had spent a long time learning to read the difference between what people said and what they meant, and she looked now with that skill fully employed, and found nothing hidden. No performance. No agenda dressed as tenderness. Only a man who had lost people he loved and survived it, and learned, through that survival, to say directly what he meant. "What if I don't know how?" she said. Her voice was very quiet. "What if I've forgotten how to be? What if I don't know how to let someone—" "Then we'll learn together," he said. "Slowly, if you like. There's no schedule." A sound moved through her, something between a laugh and a breath, both surprised and certain. The sound a door makes when it finally opens after a very long time. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. He smiled. It was the same smile he had offered outside the cottage door on the first morning, and it meant the same thing it had meant then. "I see you, exactly as you are, and what I see is enough." She placed her hand in his. The village lamp across the road threw warm light through the bare branches of the beech tree. Gideon came to the cottage 6 weeks later. He insisted on coming alone. Levvenia opened the door and immediately saw the change in him. Not age, exactly, though he looked older. Something had shifted behind his eyes, some long-maintained position that he had finally abandoned. He wheeled himself forward. Then, with an effort that made her hands move toward him involuntarily, he gripped both armrests and pushed himself upward. His legs gave way before he reached standing. He fell onto one knee beside the chair, and he stayed there, one knee on the stone step of her doorway, and looked up at his daughter. "Forgive me," he said. His voice was unsteady. "I sat in that chair for 12 years, and I watched, and I said nothing, and I let you carry it all. I let it happen." His hands were pressed flat against his knee. "I watched you burn that letter, and I did not go in. I watched that man leave, and I did not stop it. I have no excuse. I was afraid of losing you, and I lost you anyway. And I lost 12 years of your life while I was losing you. And I am sorry." Levvenia knelt on the step beside him. She held his shoulders gently, steadying him. "No," she said. "Stop." She waited until he looked at her. "You gave me life. That morning on the road. You gave me life without thinking about it. That is not nothing. That is never nothing." She shook her head. "We both made choices we cannot unmake. But I am not standing in those choices anymore. and I don't want you to stand in them either." His eyes were full. "I forgive you," she said. "I forgave you years ago. I just forgot to say so." He pressed his forehead against her hand, briefly, the way someone accepts something they have needed for a very long time. Then she helped him back into his chair, and they sat together in the doorway of the small cottage in the winter light and said nothing more for a while, which was its own kind of conversation. The wedding bells rang on a Saturday in March. The chapel was small and full of light and held 60 people, family, genuine friends, loyal servants who had not left when they might have, elderly tenants who had known Levvenia for years and had come because they wanted to, rather than because they had been told to. There were no political alliances in the pews. There was no one whose attendance needed to be managed. Levvenia wore ivory. Her hair was simply dressed. There were flowers at the altar, white ones from the garden at Ravenshire Estate, which the gardener there had grown specifically because she had mentioned in passing that she liked white flowers for their clarity. When she walked down the aisle, she was not performing anything. She was simply walking toward a person she trusted, in a room full of people who had chosen to be there. The difference between this and every other formal occasion of her adult life was so complete that she had to stop for a moment at the chapel door, one hand on the frame, to let herself feel it. She felt it. She walked forward. Cyril did not look away. Their vows were honest. They promised to tell the truth, even when it was inconvenient. They promised to share the weight. They promised a home where no one would be expected to solve every problem alone. They were not romantic promises. They were practical ones, made by people who knew what it cost to live without them. When the minister declared them married, Gideon clapped. He clapped loudly, without restraint, the way a man claps when the thing he feared would never happen has finally happened. Drusilla came to Ravenshire Estate 3 months later. She arrived alone, which cost her something. Levvenia could see the cost in the way she held herself, slightly too composed, in the manner of someone managing a performance, and aware that the audience can see through it. They sat in the garden. The spring roses were beginning. A bee moved through the rosemary. "When your father married me," Drusilla said, finally, looking at her hands, "I was afraid." She paused. "Not of you, of not being enough, of the woman you had lost, your mother, and the space she had left, and the fact that I couldn't fill it." She pressed her lips together. "I decided, very early, that you were a threat to my position in that house. And then I discovered that you were competent, and so I made you useful. And you were so useful that I stopped seeing you as a daughter at all." She looked up. "I saw you as infrastructure, as something the house required to function, and I am ashamed of that." Levvenia looked at her stepmother's face, the lines around the eyes, the tightness at the corners of a mouth that had spent a long time holding difficult things. She thought about 12 years of mornings in the library. She thought about the folded blanket placed over her shoulders while she slept. That one gesture, those almost gentle hands that had pulled back at the last moment. "I forgive you," she said. Drusilla blinked. Her composure developed a crack along one careful seam. "I forgive you," Levvenia said again, "not because the past is smaller than it was, but because I am building something now that I don't want to build on a foundation of grievance. I need the ground to be clear." Drusilla wept, quietly, with the contained quality of someone who does not permit themselves this very often. Levvenia did not move away. She sat in the garden with her stepmother while the bee continued its work in the rosemary, and the spring light came through the garden wall at an angle that made the roses look almost incandescent. She visited Amos and Isadora at the county prison, separately, on the same afternoon. Amos was thinner. The easy confidence that had been his primary feature was gone, replaced by something quieter and more uncertain, which she thought might be the beginning of wisdom if he was lucky and careful. She held his hand. She told him she hoped he would become the man their father had always seen him capable of being. He cried in a way that made her believe he meant to try. Isadora looked smaller. Not diminished, exactly. Shrunken in the way of someone who has had everything stripped back to the essential structure and is still determining what the essential structure is. She looked at Levvenia across the narrow table for a long time before she spoke. "I finally understand," she said. Her voice was very quiet. "You loved me more than I loved you, not in spite of what I did to you, just more. You loved me more." Levvenia crossed to her. The guard allowed it, briefly. They held each other through the narrow passage the bars provided. There was no anger left in Levvenia, not because she had suppressed it, but because it had completed its necessary work, and then gone. The way pain goes when the wound finally begins to close. She forgave her. She did not promise that trust would be quick to return. These were different things, and she understood the difference now. At Ravenshire Estate, spring turned and the work of the household was shared. Cyril asked her opinion on every significant decision. She asked his. When she worked because she chose to, not because there was no one else, and when she rested without calculating the cost. She started a school. Not immediately. These things take time and planning, and the kind of careful relationship building that she understood better than anyone. But by the end of the first year, in a large room in the east wing of Ravenshire Estate, 12 girls from the village and neighboring farms were learning to read, to figure accounts, to write their names in clear and permanent ink. She taught some of the classes herself. She hired 2 teachers for the others. Her father came to visit in the summer and sat on the terrace and watched her walk through the gardens with Cyril. She was laughing at something. The sound drifted across the roses, clear and easy, the laugh of a person who has stopped apologizing for the space they take up. Gideon sat very still and listened to it. He had heard that laugh when she was 17, before the road and the rain and the overturned carriage and all the years that came after. He had forgotten what it sounded like. Now it came back to him complete, as certain things come back when you have stopped looking for them. Fully, suddenly, like a light in a room you had assumed was empty. He closed his eyes. He thought, "Now I can rest." Years later, the people of Ravenshire said that their Duchess had a particular gift. She understood what it meant to not have enough, and so she gave from a place of genuine comprehension rather than comfortable charity. The workers were paid fairly because she had done the accounts herself. The tenants were heard because she had spent 12 years listening to concerns that no one else would address. The girls in the school were taught because she knew, with the certainty of personal experience, what is lost when a woman is told that her mind belongs to someone else's future. She walked through the gardens on a Tuesday afternoon in autumn, Cyril beside her. No schedule waiting on her desk, no crisis requiring management, no one calling her name from the corridors with another urgent need. The light was low and golden, the kind that makes ordinary things look like they are being gently illuminated from within. She stopped for a moment and looked at the roses and the wall and the estate stretching away to the hills and the hills going further beyond. She thought about the girl who had stood at 17 on the threshold of a very different life and promised to hold a family together. She thought about all the years in between. She thought about the notebook. She kept it still, in the drawer of her desk at Ravensshire. Not because she needed it anymore, but because it was the most complete record she had of who she had been before she understood that she was allowed to be something else. Cyril's hand found hers. She looked at him. He said nothing. He simply held on. She turned back to the gardens and the hills and the long afternoon light, and understood, with the quiet certainty of someone who has arrived somewhere real after a very long journey, that this specific moment, this hand in hers, this light, this absence of a name being called in urgency, was what it felt like to be free. She walked forward. Some burdens are placed on us without our permission. Some we accept because love asks us to, and love is not always wrong to ask. But the bravest thing a person can do is not to carry more. It is to recognize, finally, the moment when the carrying is done, when you can set it down, when the road ahead belongs to you and the person you choose to walk it with, and the light is good, and there is no emergency, and you are allowed, at last, to simply move forward. This is what Levvenia Ashcraftoft learned in the end. Not in a single moment, but across many quiet ones. Not with fanfare, but with the gradual and permanent relief of a weight released. That she had always deserved to be seen. She had simply needed to stand in a place where the right eyes were looking.